So the topic here is first-party fraud, actually when the customer ends up being the enemy to you, the merchant. I am with IT Novarka Group. We are an industry advisory and consulting firm. I am in the fraud and AML practice inside of the company, and we cover a variety of different topics in the area of fraud. That's where I specialize in, and also chargebacks. Spent 16 years in the payment processing world doing both issuing and acquiring fraud and chargebacks, and so bring a little bit of interesting perspective on both sides of the aisle in terms of both the banks and also the merchants. So first-party fraud, what is first-party fraud? Well, actually, the question is whatever name that you happen to call it. We did a survey of around 300 merchants last August-September timeframe, and what we found was that there was absolutely no consistency in terms of what people call first-party fraud. It goes by all kinds of different names. Some people call it friendly fraud. I don't think it's really necessarily friendly fraud. Some people call it transaction reversals or fraud chargebacks or whatever, but there is just no common name in the industry associated with what happens when a cardholder makes a purchase, decides to call the bank and say, I didn't do it, even though they still have the goods and services that were purchased, and they're basically just trying to avoid financial liability for their transaction. These are people, these are customers, unfortunately, who are lying in order to be able to get out of paying for the goods. This has been going on for a long time. So at least 5-10 years, this is a problem going on. But the problem is that it's been getting worse and worse over time as well as more people do it. What we're finding is that there are social media platforms where you can go out and get information in terms of, how do you go off and dispute a transaction with your bank? And it will give you the step-by-step guidance in terms of what to do, including the specific language that you need to use in order to be able to be successful at getting your claims accepted by the bank. This thing is also very similar to what we call transaction confusion. And again, transaction confusion needs a little definition because there's no standard definition for this either. But think about it when you see the statement and there's something on the statement you don't recognize. And you think it's fraud, but unfortunately it could be the transaction date or amount you're not recognizing it, or the fact that the merchant descriptor doesn't ring a bell. But with the transaction confusion is if you get enough additional information from the FI, the bank or the credit union, typically it's enough to jog your memory and you realize, yes, that's my transaction, I did it, never mind, forget about that I even called bank, and they just kind of walk away. So the dispute basically just dies right there. Whereas in the first-party fraud scenario, that dispute becomes a chargeback and then kind of flows through the system on over to the merchant. This is a pretty big issue for merchants and also for FIs. In the survey that we did last, late summer, early fall timeframe, we actually interviewed UK and US merchants about what is the amount of our percentage of transactions that fall into the 4 different buckets. Transaction confusion, I just don't remember. First-party fraud, I'm lying, I really did the transaction. Third-party fraud, the fraudster, criminal network stole your payment credentials and actually made the transaction. Or the fourth category being, I got a beef of some sort with the merchant. Item not received, item not as described, poor quality, whatever the case may be. But the cardholder acknowledges they made the transaction, but they're just trying to get some resolution with the merchant on the issue that they have with it. So those are the 4 categories. And you can see the stats right here, where at least here in the United States, almost 81% of all chargeback volume is either transaction confusion or first-party fraud. First of all, that's good news, is that a lot of this can be actually eliminated. You can really drastically reduce chargeback volumes if you can just take care of these 2 ones. Also notice here, though, that the US and the UK experiences are quite different from each other. First-party fraud, actually, transaction confusion is much higher here in the US than it is. I did not believe these numbers when I first saw them come back from the survey. And so I went back because I thought transaction confusion and first-party fraud were way, way too high on this list compared to what I remembered, 3+ years ago when I was in the transaction processing world. So I went back out and resurveyed these same merchants. Instead of using those names that you saw at the top, I put in descriptions or explanations of what each ones were. I did not use those words there. So I was thinking, okay, maybe there's some confusion on the part of the merchant. Maybe they don't understand what I'm asking about when I say transaction confusion or first-party fraud. And so I repolled everybody. These percentages only changed by 1 or 2 percentage points. So pretty interesting that we still had US and UK merchants talking about these two types of transactions or chargebacks being as high as what they were. The other thing that we ask is that of the net fraud that an e-commerce merchant has, how much of their fraud is related to first-party fraud? And what they said was anywhere between 20 and 50% of their fraud was related to first-party fraud. 2/3 of the merchants saying 20 to 50%. Again, a pretty sizable amount. So merchants certainly have a vested interest in terms of finding out how do I actually stop this? What I can do in order to stymie this behavior from going on. But the other thing about it is that banks are also very interested in stopping this as well. So this is one area where we can all come together and realize it's an industry problem for everybody. And so how do we actually put this back into the mode of the liability falls back on the cardholder as opposed to people being deceiving here? The problem with the FIs are having is that they have to hire chargeback staff in order to take those inbound phone calls from consumers. They have to be able to go off and process those. They got back office effort to go off and work through as well. And they also have the chargeback fees from the card brands associated with it too. So there's costs and money involved on both sides, merchant and FI. We have the data to solve this problem. The problem is that merchants have some of the data and FIs have some of the data. We talked about that this morning, about data being fragmented, and this is a great example of data being fragmented. But if we were able to bring both sets of this information together, we would have more of a comprehensive picture in terms of what's going on from this bad behavior by cardholders in order to be able to stop first-party fraud. But from the e-commerce side, you can take a look at the prior purchases, the chargeback history, the device information, the IP information, and a bunch of other online information available that they collect as part of the online buying behavior. On the FI side of the house, they know the complete transaction history of the cardholder. They're able to take a look at behavior, chargeback history, and also activity going on from a digital banking side, because that digital banking device data ought to be matching up with some of the digital device information coming in from the merchant. But again, two sets of data, how do you bring it together in order to be able to make an effective decision and put the liability back to where it belongs? Well, Visa has certainly been listening, and they have come out with what's called Compelling Evidence 3.0. There was a little bit of a mention of that earlier today. Out of curiosity, how many people have heard of Compelling Evidence 3.0 before today? A good number. Okay, good. So what Visa's doing here with Compelling Evidence is it's providing a way for merchants to provide the data that they have to the FI in order to be able to refute this particular dispute coming in from the cardholder. And if they're able to provide the required data, then what they're able to do then is transfer liability from the merchant back to the FI. So a pretty strong incentive from a merchant standpoint in order to be able to collect this data and in order to be able to provide it, because you get out of e-commerce fraud transactions, and which is where most of the chargebacks that you have today are coming from. There's got to be a few, and the intent is not just to put the liability on the FI and have the FI eat the costs. You know, FIs don't look and don't want to actually increase their cost structure anyone. So the whole idea is that the FI will then be able to make the decision what they want to go off and do. Likely going back to the cardholder and saying, here's the data, it proves that you did it, I'm going to reject your dispute. Now, every bank is going to have a little bit of a different perspective on that. Some banks where they're very strong from a compliance standpoint, the compliance folks may not be comfortable with it. But from a fraud law standpoint, at least you got the data, you can make a decision, and you'll be able to tell the cardholder, sorry, we're going to reject your dispute. So a couple conditions have to exist. The first one being is that there has to be 2 prior good transactions. And what we mean by prior is those 2 transactions have to have occurred 120 days or more in the past. So 4 months ago or more. That's the first condition. Second condition is that they have to be good. Good in the context that there's been no fraud, no chargebacks on these transactions. So basically, they successfully were authorized and settled, and there hasn't been any issue from the cardholder associated with them. So if that happens, if that condition exists, you got 2 good transactions, and then the next thing you need to do is take a look at the data. Look at the data in terms of those 2 old ones, those 2 good ones, if you will, from 4 months ago or prior, comparing it to the current transactions being disputed. So the first thing is that IP address, device ID, or device fingerprint. Got to have at least one of those that's consistent across those 3 transactions. Second thing is you've got to find a second data element that's also consistent. And it could be user ID, it could be their login ID, it could be the IP address, or other things along those lines. So as long as there's another second data element that's consistent across all of them, you got 2 good transactions, you got 2 consistent pieces of data across them, you can then actually push that information back to the FI, and the merchant then shifts liability over to the FI themselves. This went into effect this past weekend. So April 15th, it's a Saturday, but April 15th is when Compelling Evidence 3.0 went into effect. And the other thing about this is that this is supported in both a pre and also a post-chargeback environment. So in a pre-chargeback environment, Visa purchased a company called Verify that has a product called Order Insight. So Order Insight is a mechanism by which when the FI gets a dispute from the cardholder, the FI can then notify the merchant saying, hey, your customer is disputing this transaction. Would you want to refund it right now or maybe address it? And that's an opportunity in the pre-chargeback through Order Insight process whereby the merchant can provide the information to the FI, and then the FI can then go off and resolve this even before a chargeback gets created. Now, not all merchants, not all FIs participate in Order Insight. And so if one or both parties don't participate, then the other process then is that dispute becomes the chargeback flows through the card brands back to the merchant, and the normal process plays out like it does today. Yes?
So with Visa, there's also excessive dispute monitoring program, but also an excessive fraud monitoring program.
Yes.
And fraud being reported could be enough to put a merchant on the list, even if they're not liable for that chargeback. So can you speak a little bit more? Is that being impacted at all by compelling evidence?
Yeah, so the question is that Visa has 2 programs, an excessive chargeback program and an excessive fraudulent chargeback program. And so how does that impact it? Give me a second if you don't mind, and I got a couple slides on that as well. Now, the elephant in the room is, what's MasterCard doing? Well, MasterCard made a big splash at the Merchant Risk Council, or MRC, last year, March of 2022, in which there was a couple different sessions at MRC by MasterCard talking about some ideas that they had about how they're going to address first-party fraud. And so they've been talking to merchants and FIs about this as well and some of the ideas and plans they have. I'm a little surprised that MasterCard has not come out with something. I was expecting at MRC this year, just last month, that MasterCard would make an announcement. They didn't. I thought that MasterCard would then probably use their April compliance update going out this month to actually make an announcement. I haven't seen that either. So the question is what's going on with MasterCard? You know, this is me reading the tea leaves a little bit, but I'm thinking now that because we have not heard anything from MasterCard, even though they've been talking about it, that MasterCard's going to take a wait-and-see approach. They're going to wait and see what happens with Visa and how this plays out through over the whole ecosystem, and then possibly kind of refine whatever their plan is, and then go off and announce it. So I think the next likely time that they're going to make an announcement probably will be maybe October, because they do 2 compliance updates on the course of a year. But again, a little bit of conjecture on my part, but yeah, MasterCard is noticeably absent from this whole first-party fraud in terms of at least having an official statement in terms of policy like Visa has had with compelling evidence 3.0. So there's a couple benefits and actions needed. So if you're going to do this support on a pre-chargeback versus on a post-chargeback mode. So in a pre-chargeback mode, you need to be participating in order insights. So if you, the merchant, or the people that you deal with are not participating in order insights, you may want to look into that because you want to put it in place. If you do have support in place for order insight, you'll probably need to make some enhancements to it because there's additional data, as we saw on the previous slide, that you're going to have to provide associated with it. The nice thing about being able to handle all this on a pre-chargeback mode is that, going back to the question that you just asked about does any of these count from the standpoint of Visa's excessive chargeback program or their excessive fraudulent chargeback program? And the answer is no. So you don't have any negative impact based on this because you're handling it at the dispute stage, not at the chargeback. No chargeback has been created yet. So because of the fact no chargeback has been created, there's no chargeback program to be impacted associated by this. So it's really kind of a nice interest and benefit in terms of doing it on a pre-chargeback state, at the dispute stage rather than the chargeback stage. The other thing about Order Insight is that there is a time SLA by which you have to respond to that. And it's usually, I think, about 3 to 5 seconds, certainly it's less than 10 seconds. And so you need to make sure that your Order Insight implementation is rapid enough to be able to extract that data and push it back out within the SLAs that Visa has defined for Order Insights. So something for you to be able to look into and make sure that it's in place. Again, you're not supporting Order Insights, fine. Then we go through the post-checkout or post-chargeback process. So the dispute comes into the bank creates a chargeback, it flows through Visa, it comes into you, the merchant. Now you have the data there to go off and work with. Well, if you win this particular stage, it will not count against the merchant in terms of the Visa excessive fraud chargeback program. That's good news. It still counts, though, against the excessive chargeback program, but not the excessive fraud chargeback program, because you're basically being able to transfer liability back over to the FI, saying, hey, not my fault. So you do get some benefit, but not quite as much in the post-chargeback world associated with this. But the thing you need to be doing is you need to be capturing this data. We saw the 7 different data elements on the previous slide. That data may be scattered within your organization. You need to find some way to be able to bring it together, tied to the transaction. You're also going to need to be able to get that information to your chargeback team because they need to be able to go off and do the searches on the 2 good prior transactions 4 months ago or more, and then also being able to match the data elements between those 2 good transactions and the current one being disputed. So there's going to be some data visibility, data collection, storage, and visibility you're going to need to provide, especially to your ops team or whoever within your organization is working the chargeback process. And then the other thing you'll need to do is you'll need to be able to put together that representment or that pre-arbitration evidence, whatever you call that these days. But you need to be able to put that information together. You need to provide the history of the 2 good transactions when they occurred, the data about them so they can be found within VRO, and then also the current transaction itself, and then be able to push that back through that pre-chargeback or the pre-arbitration, the representment kind of process in order to feed it back to the FI. You do that, you're now, as a merchant, absolved from that particular chargeback, liability falls to the FI, and you're free and clear. A lot of technical details, so pause a second. Any questions on any of that? All right. So the other thing that we did in the survey out there, we asked the merchants, okay, if you go through this whole process, then what do you expect some of the benefits are going to be through a program such as Compelling Evidence 3.0? And we heard a little bit about this in some of the morning sessions. And the major area where they see improvement is going to be on the machine learning models that are being created out there today. The problem we have today is that when you build a fraud model, right now that one bucket that you have for fraud has first-party fraud and third-party fraud commingled together. And unfortunately, the two of them look very different. And so first-party fraud is hard to stop because of the fact that it looks like the consumer, the real cardholder, is making the transaction, in which they are. They are making the real transaction. So trying to stop that is hard. So the data that we have and the labeling that we have of the data today is not very good. And so the models that we're building today are a bit suboptimal. But now going through a Compelling Evidence 3.0 program, now you know which transactions are truly first-party fraud, so we can now create two buckets. We got one bucket for first-party fraud. We have another bucket for third-party fraud. And now we can also then create two sets of models. One model targeting first-party, another model targeting third-party. And so the modeling should greatly improve and increase as a result of the better labels that we're now able to apply associated with the data. The second area here in terms of lower chargeback volume, not a big surprise. You know what? You're catching the cardholder lying to the bank, and they're now having liability associated with it pushed back upon them, and so that's a good thing. There's also another little concern about this because there's some expectations that first-party fraud is likely to actually increase over the next 12 to 18 months. And the reason for that is because when you get to some of the harder economic times that were being forecasted and the economy gets a little bit rougher and unemployment starts ticking up and then people are having more trouble paying their bills, well, how do they pay the bills? Well, they call the bank and say, not my transaction. And so it's just an economic necessity, unfortunately, for some people in order to be able to figure out how to make ends meet. And so usually during bad economic times, first-party fraud tends to tick up just because of economic necessity. So another reason from a timing standpoint why having this out there and actually going off and supporting it can be very helpful from a merchant standpoint and or be able to kind of stop that type of behavior as well. I was a little perplexed personally because of this third one. I'm not quite sure where the higher customer satisfaction comes in because you're telling the consumer, sorry, go pound sand, that's you doing the transaction, I'm not accepting it. So maybe it's because of the fact that merchants now don't have to deal with some of this frivolous stuff from an ops standpoint and they have more time to be able to dedicate to their good customers as opposed to the bad customers. I'm kind of reading a little between the lines a little bit on that one, but that's what I'm thinking. And then the other one is an increase in e-commerce authorization approval rates. Again, I'm a little bit trying to struggle a little bit with where merchants saw the increase associated with that one. But I mean, that was one item that the merchants said that, yep, we believe that that's really going to be a big benefit associated with Compelling Evidence 3.0. Another question for the room. How many people today support Compelling Evidence 3.0? Couple hands. How many people have plans to support Compelling Evidence 3.0? A couple hands. Okay. And
We support it for our customers. So yeah, I'll go ways. We support it.
You support it?
We support it, yeah.
Okay. And how many merchants are still thinking about what to do with Compelling Evidence 3.0? A few more hands going up on that one. Yeah, trying to figure out what's happening there. So I think there's kind of a little bit of a cat and mouse game going on associated with this as well. Who's going to be jumping into the pool first? It takes both the merchant and the FI to participate in this in order to be able to make it all happen. And so if only FIs support it, it doesn't do any good. If only merchants support it, it doesn't do any good. You really got to be in mode where actually everybody is going off and supporting this. So that's another issue that we need to kind of take into consideration here. There was another concern that was expressed to us associated with compelling evidence by the issuing side of the house, and that being banks and credit unions want to make sure that there's good data quality coming in. How do I know that the merchant is actually sending the device ID and the IP address from two good transactions as opposed to from some other transaction that just happened to have that same ID, IP address and device ID? So there's this little bit of a, from a FI standpoint, I like it, but I need someone to make sure that the data I'm being given is good. And I've been hearing that Visa plans to do some type of analysis of the information, because Visa's got all the data, most of the data, not all, but most of the data, but they're going to be doing some analysis of the data, applying some analytics to it in order to be able to monitor what's going on and the data being sent back and forth between merchants and FIs, and hopefully defining that there aren't merchants out there trying to game the system and send data for transactions that were really not part of what was going on. So that's a little bit of the challenge associated with this, that there's just got to be a level of comfort among all the parties that everyone's playing and abiding by the rules associated with this, and no one's trying to game the system for an unfair advantage. So again, going back to the FI standpoint, what are they going to do? I don't think that many of them are going to eat these costs, but there's a lot of things that have to come into play there. One of the issues is that on the issuing side of the house, what you may or may not know is that there's Regulation E from the federal government that provides consumer protections on debit card transactions, Regulation Z that provides consumer protection on credit card transactions. And what happens is that there's auditors, federal auditors, who will come into the bank and say, okay, here's this dispute from your cardholder, show me how you handled it. Show me all the steps you took and how you came up to that particular decision. And so in that particular case, FIs are always a little bit nervous when they have that regulatory oversight in terms of what's going to happen to them. The one thing that the auditors, the FIs are really concerned about is, coming in here and saying, hey, well, what's going on? The auditor's saying, you did not dispose of this particular dispute the way you should have. Now, the other thing that's kind of a little bit odd and interesting is that I have yet to hear from Visa about what they have done to go back to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, or anybody else in the government in order to say, here's this new process that we're putting in place in order to be able to stop this so that we can get government buy-in. Because the government, if they're going to come in and audit the bank, has got to be able to acknowledge and accept the fact that this dispute is being denied counter to Reg E and Reg Z, but for what reasons? And make sure it's the appropriate and the right reasons. So that's still a bit of a test that we're going to have to kind of take a wait-and-see approach on to see how the federal auditors are going to actually think about this and how they're going to adjudicate some of these disputes that the FIs are doing. Because the FIs, if they're going to push us back on the cardholders, they have to make sure that they're not going to be penalized by the government when they go in and get audited according to these particular regulations. So we have some additional information in terms of some other reports that we've done that talk about this area.